Hey guys, so I want to do a book talk about the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Thucydides, along with Herodotus, is known as one of the two fathers of writing factual history as we now know it. Thucydides was a younger contemporary of Herodotus's, so he probably read Herodotus. Herodotus wrote a great big book just called The Histories, which was a book all about the rise of the Persian Empire and also the wars between the Greeks and the Persians, because the Persians tried to invade Greece several times, and they were finally repelled at the Battle of Marathon, which was spearheaded by the Athens and Athenians and Spartans. And Thucydides kind of picks up right after that, but Thucydides is a much different writer than Herodotus. He actually scorned certain aspects of Herodotus, because Herodotus often relied on sort of folklore and mythology to write his history, and Thucydides had none of that. He has no patience for ideas of divine providence or gods intervening in human affairs, or mytho-history of any sort, or mythological explanations for any sort of natural phenomena. He wanted to be completely objective in his history of this war, and in that sense he is sort of a big step forward after Herodotus. Although Herodotus was arguably a better storyteller, Thucydides was arguably much more factually reliable. But so the Peloponnesian War, as I said, picks up right after the events that Herodotus tells in his book, The Histories. Athens and Sparta have just repelled the Persian invasion at the Battle of Marathon, and so they, among all of the Greek city-states, are sort of the two most powerful city-states in Greece. And Athens has this organization called the Delian League, which is ostensibly sort of a big alliance, sort of like NATO, between Athens and a bunch of Greek city-states, but it slowly starts to be more like Athens' empire, because it starts to become clear that membership in the Delian League isn't really optional, because Athens starts to attack and conquer anyone who wants to leave the Delian League. But anyway, so Athens and Sparta are here in Greece as the two prominent powers. Persia is sort of, its power is in a shambles, so they really are the preeminent powers in the Mediterranean. And as tends to happen when there's sort of this power vacuum and these two new powers who were formerly engaged in an alliance that was based only on a common enemy, the Athenians and Spartans quickly become distrustful of each other. Each thinks that the other might become too powerful and might become a threat to them, and that is sort of the ultimate reason for this war that broke out between the two of them. Although there was sort of a pretense for the beginning of the war, which was a dispute between two smaller city-states, Corcyra and Corinth, but that really, Athens and Sparta used that as an excuse to start a war with each other. And yeah, so the Peloponnesian War was this huge, protracted war. It took place over the course of 30 years. And if I went too much into sort of the actual events of the war, then this video would go on forever, because there's a lot. It's a long book, and there's a lot that happens. Actually, Thucydides wasn't able to finish this book. He wasn't able to finish telling the history of the Peloponnesian War because he died before he finished his book. And actually the book ends mid-sentence, which is kind of odd. But a later historian named Xenophon would complete the history of the Peloponnesian War and write a bit about the history of the aftermath. And Xenophon himself sounds like a fascinating guy, but I can't talk about him because I have too much other things to talk about. So anyway, just a broad overview of the events of the Peloponnesian War. It can be roughly divided into three phases. There's the Archidamian War, which is which takes place mostly on mainland Greece, and which ends sort of in a draw. Sort of Athens and Sparta just declare a truce that's supposed to last 30 years and only lasts, I think, like 12 years. But so it ends in a draw, with Athens having the clear upper hand at the end. But then the war picks back up with the Sicilian War, which is where Athens decided Athens had the bright idea to try to invade Sicily, because they thought that doing so would sort of intimidate the Spartans into surrendering, because they thought if they had the Spartans sort of surrounded in the Mediterranean, they would sort of give up, because they saw that they couldn't win against that. And that ends in disaster for Athens. They lose they lose a lot of soldiers, they lose much of their fleet, and they're also just generally, humiliated, because it was just such a terrible idea. So that ends in another truce that obviously doesn't hold up, and then the Ionian War, which is the last phase of the war, begins, which was, again, mostly around the mainland Greece and around the Aegean Sea. And this is also where the Persians actually step in. The Persians offer to help the Spartans, because the Persians saw both Sparta and Athens as a threat to their power, obviously, because they're two great powers, and they also defeated Persia in a war previously. And the Persians' goal is to sort of play the Spartans and the Athenians off against each other so that they can weaken each other. And that is sort of what happens at the end of the Peloponnesian War, which Thucydides doesn't get to, but basically at the end of the Peloponnesian War, the real winners are the Persians, and also Alexander the Great, because it's probably the Peloponnesian War that weakened the Greek city-states enough so that Alexander the Great could come in and conquer them and then go on the rest of his conquests. Large parts of Greece were just in a shambles after this war, and it really was... Thucydides argues, he wants to put forth the sort of idea that the Peloponnesian War was the greatest and most epic war that had taken place up to that point. There is an argument to be made for that, because it did last 30 years. It did definitely have a huge impact, probably on all of history, because again, it allowed for the conquests of Alexander the Great, which had a huge impact on history. And so yeah, anyway, that's just a broad overview of the events of this book. And now I'm going to move on to some of my own personal impressions. If I were to sum up how I feel about this book in a sentence, I would say that I like Thucydides as a thinker, but not as a storyteller. So I will break that in half, and I will talk first about what I liked about Thucydides. I like his thinking. So the ideas in here about politics and war and human nature have been relevant throughout all of history and are still relevant today, or even more relevant possibly. There are so many parallels between the events happening here and events from throughout history. And, that is only made more apparent through Thucydides' own treatment of them, which is sort of the brilliance of Thucydides, I think, is that he saw all these ideas in the way that Athens and Sparta went against each other, that then became so universal. So, I mean, you can look at the Athens' growing empire in Greece with the Delian League. You can look at that as perhaps a parallel to European imperialism, or perhaps to American sort of imperialism in many countries. You can see the Cold War, perhaps. You can see Athens as the United States and Sparta as the Soviet Union, and see all the smaller Greek city-states as, like, the sort of smaller puppet states that the United States and the Soviet Union played against each other, like Cuba and El Salvador and Vietnam and others. You can see the Sicilian expedition, the Athens' ill-fated expedition to invade Sicily, as perhaps a parallel to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or America's war in Vietnam, both of which were pretty bad for both countries, both the invaders and the invaded. You can see at one point near the end of this book, the democracy in Athens breaks down and collapses. And you can see a parallel to the collapse of democracy in Weimar Germany when the Nazis took over, or in many countries today, because the main argument against democracy, that the sort of people engaging in the coup to overthrow the democracy, their primary argument is that the democracy is inefficient, and we're in a time of crisis, and we need, just strong leadership to just get us through this war. And that's kind of what happened in Nazi Germany. And in a certain sense, that's what's happening in many countries now, whose democracies are under threat. There's even just one passage that I really want to read where Thucydides is talking about politicians in Athens. So Athens is democracy, obviously, at this point. Still, it's early in the book, or in the first half of the book, at least. And he's just talking about politicians in Athens, and you can see that he really doesn't think very highly of them. So here's what he says of them, and I think you could say this just as easily about politicians today. So he says, "The leaders in the cities, each provided with the fairest professions, on the one side with the cry of political equality of the people, on the other of a moderate aristocracy, sought prizes for themselves in those public interests in which they pretended to cherish, and recoiling from no means in their struggles for ascendancy, engaged in the direst excesses. In their acts of vengeance they went to even greater lengths, not stopping at what justice or the good of the state demanded, but making the party caprice of the moment their only standard, and invoking with equal readiness the condemnation of an unjust verdict, or the authority of the strong arm to glut the animosities of the hour. Thus religion was in honor with neither party, but the use of fair phrases to arrive at guilty ends was in high reputation." So yeah, I mean, I read that and I think of how partisan the United States has become, with how political parties jockey for power, and often it doesn't seem like they care that much about actually governing the country well. They just care about who controls the government, between who will have it, the Democrats or the Republicans. But what I think will stick with me the most out of Thucydides is just his portrayal of the horrors of war. What war does to everyday people. He describes, there are many instances where he describes soldiers weighing lace to an entire country, but he also sometimes zooms in on a specific town or city that is destroyed. This place where the city of Mycalesus is destroyed by the Thracians, and there's this long, just haunting description of their destruction of this town. "The Thracians, bursting into Mycalesus, sacked the houses and temples, and butchered the inhabitants, sparing neither youth nor age, but killing all they fell in with, one after the other, children and women, and even beasts of burden, and whatever other living creatures they saw. The Thracian race, like the bloodiest of the barbarians, being ever most so when it has nothing to fear. Everywhere confusion reigned, and death in all its shapes, and in particular they attacked a boys' school, the largest that there was in the place, into which the children had just gone, and massacred them all. In short, the disaster falling upon the whole town was unsurpassed in magnitude, and unapproached by any in suddenness and horror." So yeah, I mean, that is quite harrowing, and not only does he look at the effects that rampant warfare will have on people, he examines the mentality that perpetuates this violence against innocents. And this is done especially in the famous Melian dialogue, which happens in Book 5, where the Athenians are approaching the town of the Melians. It's the city-state of Milos. And Milos is neutral. It has remained neutral throughout the whole war. And the Athenians approach it and tell them that you have to either join us or we're going to consider you an enemy. In this Melian dialogue, the Athenians and the Melians have this debate about whether the Melians should be obligated to join the Athenians or whether they should be left alone. And at one point, the Athenians are just saying that basically they can do what they want because they have all the power, because they're much stronger than the Melians, and the Melians are essentially helpless. And what they say is just, it's really something what they say. So here it is. They say to the Melians, of the gods we believe, and of men we know, that by a necessary law of their nature they rule wherever they can. And it is not as if we were the first to make this law, or to act upon it when made. We found it existing before us, and shall leave it to exist forever after us. All we do is to make use of it, knowing that you and everybody else, having the same power as we have, would do the same as we do. Thus, as far as the gods are concerned, we have no fear and no reason to fear that we shall be at a disadvantage. And yeah, so essentially, might makes right, right? Yeah. And I couldn't help but read that, actually, and hear Judge Holden from Blood Meridian. This chilling, terrifying character that Cormac McCarthy created in Blood Meridian. And those words would not be out of place coming out of his mouth. But yeah, so that part of it I thought was brilliant, and it will stick with me for the rest of my life. Now, on to that second point. Much of this book obviously is taken up with military campaigns, and that I personally tend not to find particularly interesting. I don't tend to enjoy reading about that. The minutiae of military strategy and the weapons of war are just not things I'm that interested in. I personally am much more interested in the psychological and political ramifications of war than I am in the actual act of war. And also the personal effects of war, the horrible things it perpetrates, and just looking at how it affects people in general more than how it actually is gone about. And I also think that Thucydides' writing makes it sort of difficult to get through. Thucydides has he writes in famously difficult Greek, with just very confusing sort of word order, very confusing sort of juxtapositions of different metaphors and things of this sort. I obviously haven't been able to read the Greek, so I'm not sure what's so difficult about the Greek, but what I think some of the difficulties of the Greek were transposed into the translation because I just found it hard at times to follow what was going on. There are obviously a lot of names to keep track of, so that makes it hard. But also just knowing where people are going or what they're doing is just what I found really hard to keep track of. And I had to read parts of this super slowly just to make sure I, knew what was happening. And that made parts of this a real slog. But yeah, and so that means that I think that this book might not be for everyone. I don't know if you don't like reading about military campaigns, perhaps. For me, it was worth it because of the insights into politics and religion and war and human nature. For that, it was worth it. But as an enjoyable reading experience, I can't exactly say that I could recommend it. But as an interesting, a fascinating, and insightful, and thought-provoking reading experience, certainly. So, anyway, that is my take on the history of the Peloponnesian War. If you have read it, give me your thoughts. I want to hear everyone's thoughts on this book, because I'm really interested in it. Anyway, yeah, so, I'm gonna sign out now, but, Thucydides, he is the man, and, I'll talk to you all later. Bye, guys.